Okay, aloha everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm actually joining you all from my home state of Texas. I'm here visiting my family this weekend. Dania asked me to kind of give some broader context as to why we wanted to have Noe join us today and provide to a really broad cross-section of our movement, some history on Native Hawaiian resistance movements and how they have been working in our state, and sort of what this ethic of Aloha Aina is here and how it should guide our work. And for me, it's in part very personal. During my PhD process, I toured 70 different food justice organizations across the country and examined their methodologies for enacting change. I really wanted to know why groups were successful. And what I found was that those groups that were really successful were so because they brought together a really broad coalition of diverse stakeholders who took ownership over the work, and they felt that it was their movement and it was their vision that they were collectively enacting. And the way that they brought together this broad coalition, so the diversity of the coalition was the key ingredient to the success, but the way that they brought together that diverse coalition was not by ignoring their differences and concentrating on shared values, right, that we all care about natural resources in Hawaii, for example, but that their differences actually mattered. It was their differences that made them strong, and it made their movement strong, and it helped them stand together and have a greater impact. And the way that they held together those differences was by doing trainings and workshops to talk about difference, because those kinds of conversations can be really difficult. And I think we all, as we've sort of been the boots on the ground in this movement, have come up against that question of identity and power, and who can speak, who has the authority to speak in our work, who has the authority to make decisions for our natural resources and our environment, who has the authority to talk about the future of Hawaii. So we know we're having questions of identity and power, and I think it's time that we start to think about how to have a really sort of complex conversation about why it is our differences that are going to make us stronger. And Mana actually has a really incredible workshop that kind of helps us ask those questions in ways that are rooted in Hawaii's history. And so the Center for Food Safety was interested in having one of these comprehensive 3-day trainings where we talk about difference in a really kind of compassionate but intentional way. And as we thought about bringing those stakeholders together, we thought, well, wow, I mean, some of the people that we want to bring together haven't lived in Hawaii for that long, and they might not know the long histories of resistance that help explain not just why our natural resources are threatened, but why they have been preserved and protected. And I think that history is in part the history of Kanaka communities in our state and their struggle for sovereignty. So this was kind of our 101 course where we could all bring together and kind of understand what the movement in Hawaii has looked like over the past hundreds of years, actually, communities fighting to protect resources and to protect all of the traditions that come with managing that resource, many of which have to do with the food that we eat and the food that we grow. And so, that also brings up a second purpose for this webinar, even if, you are not interested in being a part of a longer, more comprehensive training, but you're interested in learning the history of Hawaii. I think it also is incredibly important for helping us frame our struggle today. Because if we can understand the work that we're doing to, protect natural resources and land and health in Hawaii as a part of a much longer struggle something that has been going on for millennia in some ways across the world, then I think it doesn't just make us better at what we're doing, because we're learning from that past history of struggle. We're learning from failures and we're learning from successes. But it also helps link us to the people that are continuing that struggle today who we might not see in our work. And so that already diversifies our coalition, because we begin to see that those communities that are actively engaged in cultivating kalo are a part of the movement that's fighting to make Hawaii sovereign from agrochemical corporations. So it again creates that kind of intentional space of diversity where difference is held and maintained, but also respected. And I wanted to end on that note with a little vignette. I remember the day after Maui pulled off that crazy victory in November, I called one of the kupuna that we have been working with and has been working on this issue for decades in Hawaii. And I called to sort of thank him and acknowledge his work. And you know, he was very humble, and he was like, well, I wasn't really engaged on the moratorium issue. I didn't really speak out publicly, so I don't know why you're calling me. And I said, you know, Uncle, we ride your wave. We ride all of the waves of struggle that come before us and give us the strength and the sense of strategy that we need to enact as we move forward. And I think knowing that history, knowing those movements is only going to, again, make our coalition already broader, but it's going to make us much stronger as we stand together. So without further ado, I'm very honored that Noe has joined us here today. Noe is a professor at UH Manoa in the political science department, but in a sub-department of that department which looks at indigenous politics around the world. And I know that she's also involved in a program that brings together indigenous students from around the world to really think about how indigeneity can inform our sense of social change and strategy. And her work, for me, is so inspiring because it is so grounded. And she and I have had many conversations about how sort of being activists, being actively engaged in social struggle is really helpful in thinking about larger sort of systemic and theoretical questions, which we often engage in as academics. And so she's both an activist and a practitioner, and then she's also a wonderful mom. And I remember seeing her lecture in front of 50 people at UH with her 3-year-old on her lap, and as a mother, I was just incredibly inspired by that. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope that the transition to you is not as lumpy as it was for me.
Great, thank you, Ashley. I'm going to unmute and pass it over to Noe for the presentation.
Okay, mahalo, Ashley and Dania. Thank you very much. On behalf of Mana, Movement for Aloha no Aina, I want to first thank the generations of Po'e Aloha Aina who have preceded us. As Ashley said, we wouldn't be where we are today if not for the struggles of many, many generations of Aloha Aina who have preceded us. And I also really want to thank the Center for Food Safety for providing this opportunity for building relationships and possibilities for solidarity in building people power. Mana is a movement building organization. We are advocates and supporters of Hawaiian independence in all of its multiple forms: political, economic, gender expression, spiritual expression. And so we really appreciate this opportunity to build relationships around the kinds of values and issues that overlap between our organizations and our movements. I just want to also add, before I get into the content, that I've packed a lot into this half-hour Prezi. And so if you want to at any point go to prezi.com and look for this Prezi, it's there. There are also embedded videos in it that I'm not going to be able to show within our time frame today, but if you go to the Prezi and go through it yourself, you can see these short video clips which include the voices of other poe Aloha Aina that I think are really important to listen to. So for today, though, in this period, I'm going to break up our time together into essentially 3 sections, and these are the topics that we're going to be covering. The first is, what does Aloha Aina mean? And this is important because it has been a powerful framework and motivating ethic for political action for generations, but also because there are ways in which that term gets used in very shallow ways without understanding that fuller genealogy and context, and that can be, you know, a form of appropriation, and it can also just be a wasted opportunity, a missed opportunity to really build those deeper connections and relationships. So like this Aloha Aina recycling drive, we don't want to replicate that. The other thing that I'm going to talk about today is just a basic question of why there is a Hawaiian struggle for national sovereignty. So it is a movement about justice for Kanaka, but it also is a movement for national sovereignty, the country of Hawaii that included a multi-ethnic citizenry, and that many would argue today still does as an occupied country. And what does land have to do with that struggle? And then finally, I'm going to close with some of the major streams of the movement today and how we can support Aloha Aina resurgence, the surging forward of Aloha Aina. So first, the term Aloha Aina, oftentimes translated as love of the land, love for the land, to love the land. If we think about it in those terms, that's certainly accurate, but it's just the top of a much larger mountain that underneath is built upon the struggles of all of these kupuna that we have honored and recognized. So to begin with, Pukui, Albert, and Mo'okini acknowledge that Aloha Aina is a very old concept. They say, to judge from the many thousands of sayings illustrating our deep love for the land, that if you look at Hawaiian proverbs, Hawaiian songs, if you look at any place in our islands, there's guarantee a saying, a song, all kinds of expressions of love for that place. And that really is the foundation of Aloha Aina, that deep connection, and for Kanaka, an ancestral connection to this place. In the 1890s, this term Aloha Aina really became an ethic and a slogan that was translated as patriotism to our country of Hawaii. So not just to the land itself, but also to the way in which we organized a political body as an independent, recognized country, and a way of resisting US imperialism and corporate power and the corporate poisoning of our political systems. And so in order to talk about how that emerges at that time, I need to do a very quick sort of timeline of history for those of you who are not so familiar. So first of all, you know, Kanaka Maoli presence in the islands goes back to time immemorial, hundreds of generations. But in 1810, we know that the great chief Kamehameha unified the islands under a single rule, and this was really the emergence of Hawaii as an independent country, as an independent state. And so that happens in the early 1800s. By the 1840s, Hawaii was recognized by the major naval powers of the time. For example, in the 1843 Anglo-Franco Proclamation, both England and France recognized Hawaii as an independent nation, as a country. As when we say state in this terms, we mean it in terms of a country. And Hawaii was, by that time, a constitutional monarchy. So Hawaii had adopted many of the kinds of institutions that states in the international system of states had similarly adopted in terms of governance. It's important to know, though, that around this time there was also a gathering of power, of wealth by a small oligarchic, well, they would become an oligarchic elite. The building of really what I would call white supremacist power, of a small group of white men who were amassing economic power and their own armed militia power over time, and eventually political power as well. And so water here was incredibly important. These two dates, in 1856, the rice ditch opened in Lihue, and it was the very first time water was transferred outside the watershed. Prior to that, all of the sustainable agriculture that Hawaiians had developed over hundreds of generations allowed for water to stay in the watershed, feeding our lo'i, our mala, our fish ponds. And that taking of water outside the watershed was a really important landmark. And then by 1876, there was also the first privatization of water. This picture that you see here is one of those ditches, the McBride Ditch in Kauai, that took water from indigenous agriculture into basically plantation agriculture. So really important shifts there. By 1887, this white supremacist elite had really risen to power and had sort of consolidated that, enforcing the Bayonet Constitution upon Kalakaua, King Kalakaua. So the Honolulu Rifles that you see on the left here were the only armed militia at the time, and they were able to amass that kind of armed power in order to install law that would make racially and exclusive voting system and class-based voting system forced upon the people here. So for example, if you were Asian, you could not vote at all. If you were Hawaiian, and for anyone, there were property classifications, so you had to be of a particular segment of society by this point. And Liliuokalani then comes to power after her brother with a mandate from her people, her subjects, right, of the kingdom, to change that constitution, that people recognized that this was absolutely unjust. And so that's exactly what she meant to do. And the 1893 invasion by the US Marines supporting the sugar oligarchy, a committee of a very small group of white businessmen that wanted to grab power for themselves, was recognized by the US president himself, Grover Cleveland, as an act of war. And it was really in that context that this term Aloha Aina comes to represent expressions of Hawaiian nationalism, of loyalty to the Queen. It took all kinds of beautiful forms, including songs, including gardens, quilts. It just bloomed forth from the people in so many ways. There was a newspaper that was founded called Ke Aloha Aina. Here are two fabulous poe Aloha Aina of that time period, Mrs. Abigail Kue Helani Campbell and Joseph Navahi, who headed the Hui Aloha Aina women's and men's divisions. The Hui Aloha Aina, along with the Hui Kalai Aina, was able to organize this groundswelling of the people, and they gathered 38,000 signatures from Kanaka protesting annexation to the US. And to this day, because of their efforts, no treaty of annexation exists. That number, 38,000, was really significant because we're talking about a time at which the population of Hawaiians was only about 40,000. So the vast majority of the people they were able to organize. And Noinoi Silva, in her book Aloha Betrayed, reminds us that even though that word Aloha Aina was translated as patriotism, the Hui Aloha Aina was translated as the Hawaiian Patriotic League, she reminds us that Aloha Aina exalts the land, right? That in that saying that was uttered by Kaui Keauli, ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono, the sovereignty, the breath, the life of our land is what is perpetuated through the just act of restoring our independence, of expressing our independence. So that's really important. Now, unfortunately, you know, U.S. empire was growing and ended up taking Hawaii as well as many other territories at that time, Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, by force. You know, they had a larger military, essentially. And from that time onward, this history of Aloha Aina resistance was covered over very intentionally until this man really repopularized it. So there was a really dark period that I'm not going to talk about too much from 1898 on through the 1970s, where the history of Hawaiian resistance and Aloha Aina was very much buried. George Helm was among the 9 people who first landed on Kaho'olawe in 1976. He was a musician. He came from a farming family on Molokai, and he repopularized this term, Aloha Aina, to talk about the work that they were doing to save the island. Now, if you have a chance to look at the Prezi later and watch the embedded video of Uncle Walter Riddy speaking about what this movement was about, he says very clearly that what they were talking about was resisting the death of an island, that they saw that this island, who is a kupuna, who is a living entity, part of who we are as a Lahui, was being threatened with death, and that they felt that it was important enough to put their lives between the bombs and the island itself in order to save the life of Kaho'olawe. If you look at this quote from George Helm, I think one of the really important words that you see here toward the end is, it is a responsibility to express our legitimate concern for the land of the Hawaiian. And that responsibility is really what Aloha Aina is about. What is our responsibility to act? Aloha Aina is not just a feeling of love, sort of a sentiment. It really is an ethic that demands loving action. And so that gives you sort of a picture of the big picture of Aloha Aina in a really quick nutshell. Hopefully that when you now see this term, you'll have these stories, these people that come to mind, and we can address any questions that you may have about that as we go along. Moving on though next to why is there a Hawaiian struggle for national sovereignty, and what does land have to do with it? You know, the very simple answer to the first question is the original injury. There continues to be a struggle for national sovereignty by Hawaiians because of the original injury that took our ability to express our national sovereignty. And that is ongoing today. Last summer, the U.S. Department of Interior held hearings on every island, and there's a great testimony by Auntie Monike Ala'akaka, who's a former trustee for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs and has long been an advocate for Aina, for the Lahui Hawaii, and against militarization and contamination of our islands. And you know what she points out very clearly there is, it was a land grab. It is a land grab. It's all about land. And so when we talk about the struggle for Hawaiian national sovereignty, one of the things that my teacher, Haunani K. Trask, used to always tell us when we were students is, it's about land, it's about land. And so what we're talking about in terms of land and Hawaiian sovereignty is really the Hawaiian national lands that were 1.8 million acres of crown and government lands that the kingdom and the mo'i, Queen Lili'uokalani, controlled in 1893. These lands have now come to this time and are sometimes popularly known as the ceded lands, but they were not ceded, and that's why we call them seized and not ceded. So what happened to this land? How has this land grab taken place? Well, when the sugar oligarchy, who installed themselves as the Republic of Hawaii, came into power, it really was about them having political power to take more land for their own profits in the sugar industry. And so between 1895 and 1898, over 46,000 acres of Crown and government lands were alienated. They were sold by the so-called Republic to their friends. Following the 1898 annexation, the U.S. federal government took hundreds of thousands of acres for military use and has continued to take land for military training. This also includes some of the other sort of uses for federal buildings and national parks and whatnot. In 1921, 200,000 acres of that 1.8 million was also set aside in trust for Hawaiians of 50% blood quantum only. And this was importantly the first time that any sort of racial definition was imposed upon Hawaiians. So Kanaka understand ourselves through genealogy and our connection to land, to each other, not through blood quantum until this was imposed. So it allowed a very small window of accessibility to a small amount of land and only to a particularly racialized category of our people. The state of Hawaii was created in 1959. At that time, it received 1.4 million acres of that original 1.8 million acres of the Hawaiian national lands. So the bulk of our national lands are still controlled by the settler state of Hawaii. When the state of Hawaii was created, it was also set forth that 5 public purposes would be intended for those lands. One of those purposes is the betterment of conditions of Native Hawaiians. But again, it's important to note that this is held in trust by someone else and not rather than just actually giving the land back to Kanaka. So even though in 1993, U.S. Public Law 103-150, also known as the Apology Resolution, recognized that the indigenous Hawaiian people never directly relinquished our claims to inherent sovereignty or our national lands. And in 2008, the Hawaii State Supreme Court also recognized that the ceded lands were illegally taken from the Native Hawaiian monarchy. Those lands have not been returned, right? It's a land grab. And we can see that even though the state of Hawaii's Supreme Court has recognized that, as recently as 2009, the settler state of Hawaii has continued to assert its sovereign power to alienate, to sell, and to transfer these lands, took that case all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and in addition sought to use that racialized definition of what it means to be Native Hawaiian with 50% blood quantum in order to disqualify one of the last remaining plaintiffs, Jonathan Osorio, who was saying the state of Hawaii should not be selling or transferring Hawaiian national lands. These lands, we still have claim to them, they're unresolved, and until that claim is resolved, it shouldn't be giving or transferring or selling any of these lands to maintain the integrity of that corpus. So this is, again, all about land for us as Kanaka. And also the ways in which land provides for the health of our people. Okay, so moving on now to what are some of the major streams of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement today. What I want to talk briefly about is how there are really these 2 major streams. One that is arguing for independence and the other that's arguing for domestic dependence, or what is often called nation within a nation status under the United States. And in order to get into that, I need to do a little bit again of quick historical overview of the recent past decades. So in the wake of the United Nations being formed after World War II, Hawaii was placed on what was called the list of non-self-governing territories. Now what this did was it required the United States to report to the international community on how it was progressing with overseeing any of the territories that it had taken in its expansion of empire. When the Statehood Act was passed, the U.S. wrongfully took Hawaii off of that list. And I say wrongfully because there were all of the people who had settled up to 1959 were able to vote, and it was not an act of self-determination. So it's important to note that. From the 70s onward, you know, there was a growing movement that became articulated eventually as the sovereignty movement, but because this history of Hawaiian independence, of Hawaiian resistance, and Aloha Aina had been suppressed for so long, it took some time before people were articulating it in that way. But what people were articulating very clearly from 1970 onward was that people wanted to protect a way of life that had been maintained on the land. And so what you had in the wake of statehood and this rush of development, so as Hawaii becomes a so-called state of the United States, there was a rush of settlers here to the islands. And so in order to attract more people and foreign investment, there's a ramping up of development on the islands. And thus, Hawaiian and local working class, multi-ethnic communities were being displaced. And this is exactly what was happening in Kalama Valley in the development of what is now, you know, upper middle class subdivision in Kalama Valley on the east side of Oahu. And it was just one of many, many land struggles where people who had been working the Aina, people who were, you see George Santos in black at the microphone here, he was a pig farmer, were being moved off of their lands, and people were arguing for people, not profits, yeah, which is a motto that we've recently also used again. Now, one of the things also that as there's this explosion of activism sort of throughout the United States, the settler state government, the United States government at that time is also acting to contain these expressions, right? So the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was one act that we can look to as a way in which the United States federal government has dealt with peoples who are expressing their rights to continue to live as self-determining nations. And the key word here is settlement, that this really was a settlement of any claims that those who decided to participate would put aside those claims in order for a certain limited amount of rights and cash. And really corporations in the Alaska context, the formation of corporate entities. So as early as 1974, we see in Hawaii similar attempts. So in 1974, U.S. Senator Spark Matsunaga introduced the Hawaiian Native Claims Settlement Act, and you see that name very closely paralleled the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which included $1 billion, which they had proposed to give to be held in trust by the Department of Interior and would benefit a Native Hawaiian corporation. So you can see how the government is trying to, you know, manage what's happening here. On the Aina, though, there were continued expressions of people power, of people expressing their continued love and connection for the Aina. This is a photo of a familiar person to many in the food movement, Uncle Walter Riddy, just about to land on Kaho'olawe during the first landings on the island to protest the U.S. Navy's continued bombing of the island. And this struggle was really important because it was also about renewing the spiritual ceremonies and connection that honor and renew Hawaiians' relationships to our Aina. In 1977, the Waiahole Waikane Community Association had been fighting against suburban sprawl development by Joe Powell, the Windward Partners, and the McCandless-Marks family. This was a multi-ethnic struggle. It was really one that had to do with both, Hawaiian connection to place, kuleana, but also Asian tenant farmers who were living and working all as part of this community. The Waiahole Waikane Community Association executed a full blockade of Kamehameha Highway and was able to be successful in maintaining their presence. And it's because of that earlier struggle that there has been an outgrowth of that in terms of the struggle for water and kalo restoration, taro restoration. There were also struggles like this one at the Hilo Airport, where Kanaka were explicitly coming forward and saying that, in this case, the airport was located on Hawaiian homelands and no money, no revenue was being put forward to support Hawaiians and homesteaders. So out of that, all of those sort of the government efforts to contain and these land struggles, there really started to emerge these two streams of Hawaiian sovereignty movement. One which as early as 1978 was talking about what was going on as a foreign occupation, that the U.S. is continuing to participate in a foreign occupation of Hawaii as an independent country. And then you had also that same year the creation of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs as a state office within the state of Hawaii that would receive certain funds out of the public lands trust, the Hawaiian national lands that were being called and are being called the ceded lands, for programming for the benefit of Native Hawaiians. And so it's really at that point that you really see this clear sort of movement toward two major streams of the movement, one which is advocating for independence and seeing Hawaii as a national entity, an independent country. And this movement has really sort of also sort of branched within it into two major streams. One that's advocating decolonization under the United Nations processes for decolonization and self-determination, and the other that is arguing for deoccupation of Hawaii, also under international law and the international regimes governing war and belligerent occupation. So I'm not going to say too much about these in the interest of time, but you should know that both of these are here and that if anyone wants to talk about them a little bit more, we can. Then the other model is domestic dependence, nation within a nation. And the genealogy here is that in 1993, President Clinton signs an apology to Hawaiians. The Department of Interior undertakes research and reporting and issues this recommendation for reconciliation. Over the next 13 years in the U.S. Congress, Daniel Akaka leads the effort to promote federal recognition through the Native Hawaiian Governing Entity Reorganization Act. Importantly, reorganization has a very specific meaning within U.S. law that I won't get into at this point, but it really is about containment, as I talked about, within U.S. supreme authority. And because that piece of legislation didn't get anywhere, really, over that period, state legislators from the state of Hawaii put forward Act 195 to establish Kanaʻiolo Walu, which would provide for a state recognition of recognized Native Hawaiians who are part of a roll process. And that's sort of where the process is at now. To close, though, what I want to really talk about, because I think those, and particularly people who are outside of the Hawaiian community or outside of the movement but who want to be supportive, kind of get lost in how should I participate and where should I support. I want to bring us back to the root of Aloha Aina, which is what we talked about earlier. And what people can really do is to participate in the supporting the resurgence of Aloha Aina. And I would say and want to suggest that there are at least four that I'll put forward here, elements or strands of this that can be supported. One is, that ancestral connection of Kanaka to land, and the loving connection that many have who now reside on Hawaii to land, and that land itself be something that can feed us. Aina is not just about inert property, it's about land being something that has a productive capacity to feed us, and that land is someone, not something. So supporting the restoration of technologies like fish ponds, of lo'ikalo, of other ways that Hawaiian communities and our multi-ethnic communities can come together to make the land productive again, to feed each other, is a really important aspect of Aloha Aina. This is a photo of He'eia fish pond. The renewal and regular participation of Kanaka and those whom we also invite in to participate in ceremonies recognizing our connection to Aina is really important. And here I want to give a quick shout out to the people who right now are standing on Mauna Kea, trying to protect this sacred piko, this sacred place of our people, Ka Mauna Awa Kea, from development and expansion of industrial telescopes there. So supporting ceremony, supporting language learning, really crucial, something that anybody can do, begin to learn the language. If we're going to bring Hawaiian language back into full usage, it's something that we need everyone, Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian, to be participating in. And there's so much richness in the language and our mo'olelo that we are not able to access if we don't know the language itself. And then finally, indigenous political processes. What are the political processes by which we make decisions and lead our people? Those are all crucial parts of Aloha Aina. And to come back to what George Helm said, it's about responsibility. What is the kuleana, the responsibility that each of us has from our different position to enact and practice Aloha Aina? And it's also really about relationships, reciprocal relationships. How can we be in a relationship of balanced reciprocity with the Aina, with each other? And really, this is all part of Aloha. And that's the end of the formal presentation, but happy to take questions or discussions, particularly about connecting to movements that folks who are participating are interested in and involved with.
Great, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Everyone who is listening, please go ahead and submit questions if you have them. We have a couple minutes to address them. So first, I'm going to take a question from Michelle Brown. In the process of coalition building, how do you celebrate the difference and utilize the strengths without co-opting or submising Native or Indigenous struggles?
Good question. I think that one important piece is, as I said, is sort of the invitation. I mentioned that briefly, that an important aspect is being invited into a struggle, and then when you are invited in, showing up regularly and just showing that you have a commitment to action and to having a stake. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, great, thanks. So a question from Stacy. What literature would you recommend to me that would describe Aloha Aina?
Oh, there's so many great things. So I would say if you're reading in English, that Noi Noi Silva's book, Aloha Betrayed, is an excellent source relating to the movements of Aloha Aina in the late 19th century and very early 20th century. Kamana Beamer's new book, Namako Kamana, Liberating the Nation, I think is a really important one as well. There are just so many wonderful sources. Katrina and Kapa Oliveira's new book, Ancestral Places, it's about Native Hawaiian geographies, is really kind of more about Hawaiian ways of thinking about place and expressing connection to place. That's a great one. I was able to participate in co-editing a collection called A Nation Rising that has a lot more about some of the various struggles that I mentioned here, including Waiahole Waikane and Kaho'olawe. So those would be the first things that come to mind.
Thanks. So I think we have time for one more question from Michelle. Does the same term Aloha Aina extend to coastlines in Kai, or is there another term? Is it seen as a sea of islands?
Oh, okay. Yeah, good question. So yes, when we talk about Aina, it's including understood as including the Kai region. So, for example, the way that we've understood the ahupua'a, is from tip of mountain out to the reef, so into the ocean itself. I think there are some different things that go on when you get further out into the deep ocean, the moana nui, but certainly the Kai is part of what we're talking about in terms of Aloha Aina. There's, I think one of the genius aspects of Hawaiian land systems is that it thinks about the ways that what happens in the uplands impacts and is mirrored in what happens in the lower regions. So, for example, when you think about fish ponds and the restoration of our fish ponds, we can restore the structure of the fish ponds, but they're not going to come back to full health and full productivity until we have health in the uplands, which means flowing freshwater streams, a lack of pollution, a lack of runoff that comes from when you over develop, and that is really essential to the health of the whole system.
Okay, I think we might be able to squeeze in one more question, and quickly to answer, Crystal, your question, we'll include the list of books in the follow-up email. So one quick question from Nancy Redfeather. Can you share ideas you might have for connecting these living ideas with our haumana today?
Sure, I think, there's a lot of great things already happening in schools and communities to have young people develop from the earliest ages a loving relationship with our Aina. We need to move away from a school system where students are constantly indoors and every now and then get to go on a field trip outside, to a system in which young people from the earliest ages through the life cycle get the opportunity to develop a relationship with Aina, with our natural resources, with our streams, with our fisheries. It's really only in developing those intimate, loving relationships that people will be able to act. Yeah, and that is built upon both knowledge of the natural rhythms and the the ecosystems of these places, but it's also built upon the memories that you have of what it's like to swim and play with your friends at a fresh and healthy flowing stream, or at the kai, what it's like to go with your parents up into the mountains to gather. Those kinds of memories and experiences are what Aloha Aina is built upon.